So, what is the only real training method or style or modality that you actually need to worry about when you're looking for fat loss? A lot of people will tell you stuff like low intensity, steady state, aerobic training, or what people call cardio is going to be best for fat loss. A lot of people will tell you high intensity interval training, HIIT training is going to be best for fat loss. And people will start doing that type of training and will actually potentially get a fat loss result. And then they'll then think it was down to that style of training that brought those results. But here's the thing. Those types of training aren't going to bring fat loss around directly. Okay? They don't create a fat loss response. Those types of training you can do, and you can also not do, and still get a fat loss response. So they're not the best for fat loss. In fact, when it comes to training, there's actually only one that you really want to make sure that you are doing for fat loss. Now, let's bear in mind before we start going into what that is, we have to understand what fat loss is. Fat loss is the retention of muscle mass because the only weight you're wanting to lose is predominantly fat mass. That's the difference between fat loss and weight loss. Weight loss is losing weight from wherever, which can include muscle mass. But if you're going down the route of fat mass, you want to retain your muscle mass. That is the biggest indicator here as to what training you want to include and you want to be doing for sure when it comes to fat loss. And it isn't HIIT training, and it isn't low intensity steady state training either. It is in fact weight training, resistance training. The way you keep muscle, the way you retain muscle, is the exact same way that you go about building muscle. Weight training, resistance training is going to be the training modality which is going to help you retain muscle mass. While you're going through a fat loss phase, you still want to train in the same way you would be when you're trying to add muscle mass. You still want to be training with the same intensity. You still want to be training with a similar amount of volume. You still want to be using the same rep ranges. The finer details of the style of training within weight training might differ a little bit, yes, but for the most part, it's going to be the same. Now, does this mean that HIIT training and cardio, low intensity steady state training, is pointless, is useless? No. It can be helpful. They all have the pros and the cons. They all have different reasons as to why they can be helpful. For example, low intensity steady state cardio is exactly that. It's low intensity, which means it's easy to recover from. It's not that taxing to do it. So if you're finding yourself lower on energy because you're in a deficit, it might be a beneficial tool to use. However, to burn the same amount of calories, it's going to take longer. Whereas HIIT training, to burn the same amount of calories, the benefit of that is that you can do it in a shorter amount of time. However, HIIT training is then more taxing. It's more stressful. It's going to be harder to recover from. If people aren't managing that very well, overtraining could then potentially become an issue. So these are the things you have to take into consideration when deciding away from weight training. Overtraining modalities that you might use or want to bring in. But you don't need to use them to get a fat loss response. Okay, the reason why they can help and be useful for the most part is because they can help expend calories. And if we wanted to get a fat loss response, we know we need to be in a calorie deficit. Okay, so if we're using these training modalities to help us put ourselves into a calorie deficit, then yes, they can be a useful tool, but they potentially aren't needed. You might be able to get a great fat loss response by simply training through weight training and getting in daily steps. Also, obviously, managing and controlling food intake. People might be able to do simply those two things and still get a fantastic fat loss response. Some people might need to burn more calories, and then those training modalities could potentially help. But if someone is telling you you need this training when it comes to fat loss, and then they reference either low intensity steady state or HIIT, they're talking nonsense. Don't get it confused. Those types of training aren't directly causing a fat loss response. If you weren't in a deficit and you were doing those types of training, you wouldn't drop body fat. The deficit is creating the fat loss response. Those types of training could potentially help get you into that calorie deficit. That is the main takeaway. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like. If you have any comments on this, throw them down below. If you haven't already, do subscribe. I'll catch you on the next one.